Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session where we'll be hearing from Cladding Safety Victoria CEO Dan O'Brien on all things cladding rectification. Great to see so many of you already in attendance today. My name is Andrew Cellini and I'm the State Building Surveyor. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Our session today covers the progress and findings from Victoria's unique cladding rectification program led by Cladding Safety Victoria. Rectification is progressing at pace with the aim of restoring safety and confidence of building owners and occupiers and the Victorian community. To date, VBA's statewide cladding audit has inspected over 3,200 buildings, with more than 50% of the buildings assessed by an expert panel still presenting at elevated fire safety risk. The VBA has been delegated by the Minister of Planning to carry out functions for almost 330 of the highest risk buildings across the state, whilst council municipal building surveyors are also dealing with large numbers of buildings. It is in this space that cladding enforcement and cladding rectification intersect. Since CSV was established in 2019, we have been working closely to establish a clear and consistent approach for building owners to navigate the cladding rectification pathway. Many of you will be aware that the statewide cladding audit has revealed systematic failures in the design, certification and construction of buildings over time. Some of the non-compliances go beyond combustible cladding into the essential safety systems designed to protect occupants in the event of a fire, as well as the as-built fire-rated elements such as external wall systems that fail to offer the required fire protection and structural integrity required by the National Construction Code. Navigating this risk has been challenging, but it's pleasing to see the progress CSV is making in getting on with the work to rectify combustible cladding risks. As work on site progresses, more issues are identified and with them opportunities to reflect on past performance of the industry and apply learnings to improve safety and compliance standards for the future. I'd now like to welcome Dan O'Brien, CEO of Cladding Safety Victoria, to discuss the program and findings in greater detail. Dan, welcome.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we meet today, or at least where I am, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Can I pay my respects to the elders past, present and those emerging. Today, I want to take you through where we're up to in terms of the program, and to make sure that we sort of cover off some of the sort of key themes that we're seeing through the work that we are doing. So I want to cover off the progress. I want to talk to you a little bit about how Cladding Safety Victoria is working through the ordering and sequencing of works that are being prioritised, and give you a bit of an understanding of that process that we need to apply with our limited funding and the many buildings that we have to work through, and so I'll give you a bit of an insight into that process. Andrew's mentioned the extent of other building defects, so I want to talk to you about some of the things that we have discovered in the process of cladding rectification, and the important steps we've taken to be able to, working with the VBA, to prioritise the cladding removal and replacement works. And that sequencing of works enables us to continue to work at pace to get cladding removed. I want to talk about the insurance package that, for those that are in the program, how that extends coverage and gets a consistent basis of consumer protection, and gives an opportunity for practitioners to participate in a very complex environment. And then I want to just summarise a few other observations. But firstly, let's go back to the beginning. Those of you all remember the lacrosse fire in November 2014. I suppose kick-started Victorian government focus on the presence of combustible cladding. And by the time the Grenfell Tower and the Neo fire took place, the government was well underway in terms of working through the problem, how to deal with with combustible cladding. So they convened the Victorian Cladding Task Force. They initiated the statewide cladding audit. I think we're one of the first states to initiate a statewide cladding audit. In July 2019, Cladding Safety Victoria was established, given a bucket of funds to deal with the highest of the riskiest buildings. And there, in the background is also a building reform agenda, which has reached a very important milestone with a draft report that is out. Now, in terms of progress, I think the progress has been, I'm very pleased with the way we've been able to tackle the challenge of putting in place a delivery framework that enables us to deal with things at scale. So when I started back in July 2019, August 2019, there was around about 400, just over 400 buildings that have been identified through the statewide cladding audit as buildings of higher risk posed by the combustible cladding. Today, we're sort of sitting at around about 695 buildings that have been referred to CSV. And as we break that down through our process of both engagement, extensive due diligence, and the appointment of key practitioners to get the works underway, I think we've made some good progress. So to date, we've worked with over 528 building owners and through owners corporations, and had, I suppose, inducted into the program and got them through a process of registration, which has been very important, because the registration process is an opportunity for the owners to actually provide the information that they have, and they've been able to comply on their own building. And remembering that this is a program that is really led through the owners corporations, and we're there supporting them. The owners corporation very much takes responsibility for the building works that get undertaken on their property, and also the response that they make to the building notices and building orders that may be on them through the regulators. So we've done 528 of those engagements. We've had 380 intensive due diligence inspections. You can see in the right-hand side there's a facade engineering team that's going up the facade of a building in the city to examine the type of cladding that is on the building in different spots. Our due diligence inspections are, I think, a really important part of the program. It's where the facade engineers, fire engineers and quantity surveyors give us a sense of the magnitude of the rectification and the potential cost. Once we've made decisions to fund, and we've made 249 decisions to fund works, we appoint a project manager, and that project manager we appoint in conjunction with the owners. And it's a very important role. The project manager represents both the owners, but also acknowledges the state has an investment in the building, and that we need to work together. That's the role of the independent project managers, to keep the teams working together to make sure that the works, construction works, are done in a timely way, but also in a professional way. It's the independent project manager that takes the building to the market to identify the builder, and works with us at the end after they've identified the builder as to whether that builder is suitable, and the builder should come through the residential cladding rectification register, a panel of builders that we have, about a panel of practitioners that has been set up for this purpose of cladding works. And to date, we've appointed 246 independent project managers, and that's when the works really start to get underway. At the moment, we've had funding agreements for 228 owners corporations have signed funding agreements for works. That means all the terms and conditions of that funding agreement, the identification of the builder, and a building program is all being worked out by that point. So we've got 228 of those funding agreements signed up, and we've got 142 builders contracted at the moment to commence cladding removal construction works. And we go through these are design and construct contracts, AS 4300, and that 142 will escalate over the next couple of weeks. And we're still on target, we believe, to have 200 buildings assigned to builders by the end of this financial year. It'll be tight, but that's where we're getting very close to that point. I always think it's really important to remember that 695 building means around about 37,000 individual homes. So we're dealing with a big portion of the community here. And we should never forget, for those of us in both the regulatory space, the rectification space, and of course the building practitioners, these people's homes. And there's a lot of work when it comes to cladding that needs to be done on those homes. As I mentioned, I think we're on target to meet our at least the first stage of that target 400, which is 200 buildings into the market by the end of this financial year, assigned to builders, and 200 the following year. That's the sort of KPIs that Cladding Safety Victoria is working towards, and I think we're moving quite well. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about very shortly is the work that we've done with CSIRO in terms of sequencing and sorting these first 400, but I'll get to that in a minute. Just to break down, some of you who heard me speak before would see these slides. The sort of proportions don't really change. The top 10 LGAs are there listed on the left-hand side of that slide. The numbers change within them, but broadly, that sort of composition of the top 10, I don't expect to change really. I think that's where the infill development occurred over the last 20 years. Importantly though, it's important to reflect and continue to reflect that we're dealing with around about 75% of the buildings are 4 stories and below. About 70%, I should say, 70% of the buildings are 4 stories or below that we're dealing with in our 695 to this point. So that's a really significant proportion of buildings that, of course, are timber framed, or generally timber framed, and that creates its own complexity. In terms of the composition of the cladding on it, cladding type, it's broadly, proportionate between EPS and ACP and a mix of both. I suppose when you're dealing with a lot of smaller buildings or 4 stories and below buildings, you're going to expect that there will be a fair bit of the EPS on timber frames. Shouldn't forget the government program. The government program, Cladding Safety Victoria, also has a significant role there supporting the works and encouraging government departments to remove the combustible cladding. 172 buildings were actually in scope for review, not 112. 112 buildings were funded for some sort of works. In terms of the work that's underway, we've got 61 actually completed, which is terrific. There's around about 35% or 12 buildings that are underway currently, and we've got another 39 buildings that are in the design and tender stages. I think the government program will finish around about 12 months ahead of schedule. The more complex buildings in the hospital space are probably the exception, and there was certain very good reasons last year, of course, why those projects were delayed, and priority was given to sort of COVID operations. However, we hope to get the majority of the hospitals underway by the end of the calendar year, and certainly underway and completed in the first quarter of next year. So of the 112, I think probably 109 should be completed by the end of this calendar year, with about 3 going over into next year, which I think is a great story, because we've got some learnings that come out of that government program that has also supported the work that we do in the residential side. Now, one of the key expectations of Cladding Safety Victoria, as articulated or as set out in the Cladding Safety Victoria Act, is that Cladding Safety Victoria has to prioritise buildings. It has to establish a prioritisation framework. We've worked, I think, extensively with CSIRO's Data 61 team. That's a data analysts team that's highly regarded right across Australia, if not internationally, to develop a model to be able to sort and sequence the buildings that we have been referred. I'll just take you through it in a very sort of, I suppose, brief way, and there's much more detail which we could go through and probably deserves its own session. But that we're dealing really with a process of, as I say, sorting and sequencing buildings, separating buildings into higher risk and lower risk. So in the first instance, we apply a filter that looks at the extent of cladding coverage. And we're trying to assess here the worst case facade fire spread of a building. And we look at, and again, we're trying to establish the impact of the combustible cladding in terms of accelerating the fire spread. And in all the material we've got, we're separating out and looking very, very closely at what we call the cladding risk premium. And that's an important part of this process. As a government program, when the government announced this program, it was all about addressing the impact of the combustible cladding on buildings. Unfortunately, we're not there to fix every other building defect. We're there to deal with the highest risk that's posed by combustible cladding. So we look at the extent of cladding coverage, and we look at the configuration of the cladding, whether it's vertical or horizontal strips. Look at the type of cladding, and we look at the number of SOUs impacted. And that gives us a sense of what is a potential fire spread. And we sort buildings into lower risk and higher risk. So here on this diagram, you see a lower risk building would be a building above 10 stories that's sprinkled, that where the fire spread may extend to perhaps 3 apartments on the outer face, but gives enough opportunity for fire services to be able to deal with it. What would be considered higher risk in a tall sprinkler building would be if that fire spread accelerated to something above 3. So here I've got an example, the fire spread is 10. That building goes into a group of higher risk. In terms of the shorter buildings, we do the same thing. And we're really looking at, again, fire spread across apartments, as well as whether or not the building is sprinkled or not. So that gives us an opportunity to say that, whether or not we can support evacuation and fire, and make sure the fire can be managed and exit can be managed. So we're sorting buildings according to, at this point, where we see the risk to lie in terms of the impact of facade fire spread. Then we go further and we really look at and assign essentially a code against each building. And it's a binary situation where we're looking at what is the exit risk, what is the type of cladding, what is the firefighting potential in the building, the speed of evacuation, the egress provisions, and the number of SOUs. And we create a code building by building. And where we've seen, the reason we put them in codes is to make sure that we can categorise and determine which of the buildings should proceed first. So ultimately, through this coding and sequencing, this sorting and sequencing, we're trying to create a batting order of buildings. At the moment, through the buildings that we've looked at, across the 695 buildings, we have around about 81 unique cohort codes. Those codes cover 363 of those 695 buildings, and we continue to apply this methodology across all the buildings to get a sense of where every building sits. So every building has a code, and it's the codes enable us to start to say, if we have a certain amount of funding, we can go further down the list, but if we only have a certain amount of funding and the funding is capped, where we draw the line about where we can intervene. Essentially, we're trying to create a point, very clear point of intervention for state government works, state government support. The sorting and sequencing is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a way of working out relative risk. And importantly, it's a start. It's not the end of the process. It's the start of the process. It gives us an idea of which buildings we should focus on first, and then we look at making sure that we can do our normal, take it through the normal delivery process, through the our investigation pathways, our due diligence, and making decisions based on the risk. Again, I think this is probably worthwhile that we have a greater session where we put in further material out, both on our website and others, so that practitioners can understand that, you know, we're there to deal with the highest risk buildings first. We've got a particular methodology around that, and it's an important process that we have to be able to rank buildings. It also acknowledges that not every building can be done at once, and indeed not every building may get funded. So it's important that we establish a very, very robust risk prioritisation methodology. Now, I'm going to go into some of the issues beyond cladding, and there's plenty of good examples that we have. And in this diagram, you'll see you know, a range of issues. You can see on the left-hand side the impact of water on frames, and that sort of stud work there is highly rotted. Above there, the balcony beam, again, on the right-hand side, highly rotted. Now, if I thought through the sort of top sort of 4 or 5, 6 or 7 types of defects that we've seen once we're doing these works, it would probably be in the order of this sort of order. The lack of fire check, both external and internal, you know, providing that protection to the external frame, significant defect. The structural degradation due to water ingress, as we see in this photo, where wooden studs, window frames and lintels are rotted, and where you have rotted and rusty base plates. Waterproofing is a huge issue, as I flick through here. Waterproofing, where you may have a lack of waterproof, weatherproof membranes on balconies. The water returns into apartments. Here, the right-hand side there, you can see a significant amount of mould, hazardous mould that's built up in this particular behind the facade of this building. We see cracked and often open exposed facade material, particularly on rendered buildings. Lack of maintenance by owners, lack of good quality build as well. Cracked, a lack of fire protection in terms of facade protection. So you've got many penetrations, whether it be electrical, air conditioners, lights that haven't been fire collared. The fact that sometimes combustible cladding gets terminated behind balcony membranes into the window frames, which means it's very difficult to get to that particular cladding, and there'll need to be, you know, some combustible material left in situ, possibly forever. So these are the sort of range of defects that we're seeing, and it's been, I suppose, an eye-opener, but it's nothing that people hadn't forewarned us at Cladding Safety Victoria that this is what we'd see behind these facades, and we have. I'm not saying we've seen them on every building. That would not be the case, but we've seen them on too many, and it's I suppose it's a question of you know, really how it happened in the first place and how you deal with it in the second place. And we're left with the task of, I suppose, assisting owners deal with it. And a key part of that, and an early blocker, I think, was how do you sequence works when you've got all this non-compliance and defects that sit behind the cladding? And so that was a cause of much consternation at the back end of last year, and we worked very closely with the Victorian Building Authority, and we had our fair share of arguments, but we all agreed that the important work of cladding rectification needed to be prioritised, but that other non-compliances would need to be addressed through a subsequent phase of building works. And so the process that we've adopted is essentially through our due diligence phase, we now look at buildings with regard to the works that need to be undertaken for cladding rectification, but also what are those potential non-compliances that need to be addressed, particularly where they're fire safety related non-compliances or structural type defects that need to be addressed. And so what we do is document those, and we forewarn the owners that this might be the case. We document those and work with the relevant building surveyor and the municipal building surveyor, who has a key role here in terms of how these works get the attention that these works require post Cladding Safety Victoria's cladding removal and replacement. So that's a really important step. So one, we agreed that the cladding rectification works could be prioritised, that where we could proceed in a logical way with cladding replacement, removal and replacement, we would do so. Now, there are instances of buildings where it's difficult to do that with the framework that is either rotted, degraded, needs attention. Where our works are interrupted by those types of structural defects, it's really a case of working closely with the owners, because these types of works will be funded by the owners. There's a limit to where our funding goes. So we acknowledge collectively that the broader defects may present risk to building occupants and fire rescue personnel. They're documented, and the MBS and other regulators, RBS, have a clear insight in terms of what those particular issues are, and it sits with them to enforce them subsequent to our works. Gets to the point of what is the scope of our funded works? Well, our funded works really are around combustible cladding replacement, so it's removal and replacement, replacement of sarking and insulation, the provision of external fire-rated linings where they're required. We do not fund the provision of internal fire-rated linings or passive fire system upgrades. And we do not fund the construction of new spandrels. And while we might fund other items that limit fire spread, the reality is most of those other costs, the majority of those other costs, will sit with the owners. So early identification is very important. Where we suspect a building is particularly worse for wear, we do our own preliminary or extensive, I should say, engineering assessment that those particular buildings. So in addition to our due diligence inspections, but I've got to say, even with sort of further engineering work on more than a couple of buildings, you really only know the extent of the damage once you remove all the cladding, and that's a it's a difficult thing to deal with. Again, fortunately, that's not, we've got 130 odd projects underway at the moment. That would only be on a handful of them that we were seeing this, but it's enough. It's enough to call out. It's enough to make sure that we've got a process to deal with them, and I think that's really important. Now, given the complex nature of the program, given the state of the market that we've got, given the need to give owners, I suppose, some sort of confidence about warranties into the future, we developed in conjunction with the lead department, DALP, we developed an insurance package to cover the program, and that was after a sort of a long market search. It was about trying to unblock the problems in the professional indemnity market as well. That was a big part of it. It was making sure that we got general public and products liability sorted in a consistent way, and that there was some cover for construction risk and material damage. So we pulled together that package through a broker, and that was an international search to see, who would cover it. There's a link in this presentation for those that want to know the details of that particular cladding program or cladding insurance cover, but it's a very important part of making sure that we get the right building surveyors and fire engineers who had limited cover and with many exclusions for cladding into the program to support the work that we're doing, but also most importantly support the owners. And so that's been a big step. So just to focus in on the professional indemnity component, we're really covering all those involved in the design phase of the program. So that might be the fire engineers, it may be the builders themselves, it may be architects and others that are involved in that stage. It's a key part of it. So really, professional indemnity cover goes to any party that's contracted by the principal, or a design and construction firm, any of those on an insured project, they get cover. So the FSE engaged by CSV for design work will be covered. The architect gets covered. The RBS engaged by the building owner, or potentially CSV, on behalf of the building owner will be covered. The project manager, or we call the IPM, engaged by CSV, is also covered. In respect of design liabilities, the GNC builder is covered for the private residential program. Other consultants engaged by the builder for design works or subcontracted. The Clerk of Works teams, which I haven't mentioned, but the Clerk of Works process is now well and truly underway, overseen by CSV to make sure that the buildings and works that we've got underway have a real focus on quality, a real focus on safety, and they've been rolled out onto site with the which has really increased our, I suppose, eyes on the sites to make sure that we're getting quality outcomes. But covers those involved in the Clerk of Works, as well as the design consultants, appointed by the government departments for the government side. Now we're getting close to the end, but I just want to cover off on a couple of issues if I can, and I'm okay for time. One of the things, a couple of sort of learnings to date is we have had, I think, a bit of a reawakening of the level of effort that is now expected in the design phase. And I think it's important that we all get up to speed with the documentation and the advice that's required to be able to demonstrate that under a design and construct contract, the design itself is a viable and compliant design. We have had our issues, and we're dealing with most of those issues with respect to the quality of the information and the expectation of the relevant building surveyor of builders of what they need to provide. Those issues are being dealt with, and we're working now through those. But it has been an eye-opener. When you sign a design and construct contract, you need to know what the D means, right? It's important that there's an alignment between the relevant building surveyor very early on with the builder about what's expected to meet that standard. Another issue that's been pretty clear is that CSV has often played the matchmaker role between product manufacturers, builders, and the relevant building surveyors and other professionals. Didn't expect that we'd have to do that, but we are doing that. And I think it's a good role for government to be able to bring different parties together so that there's a much better understanding of how a particular product works in practice, how it's, what's expected in terms of the implementation of that product to make it a compliant application of it. So I think the more work we as an industry do to knowledge share about how particular products should be used and when they shouldn't be used, I think is really, really important. And I think it's a role that CSV's played to date, but it's a role that the industry is going to have to take back and make sure that there's the right forums for that. Now, sort of a third learning, we've got a handful of buildings that began prior to CSV's existence, and there is an opportunity for some building owners to come back in a limited way for retrospective funding. But what we're noticing through the costs of those works, the costs that have been put to us for potential payment, is they exceed the average or per square metre cost, the average per square metre cost of cladding replacement, cladding removal and replacement, by up to 30%. The practitioner costs, the advice costs for fire engineering reports and other things also exceeds the costs that we're seeing through our oversight. So that tells me that there is a bit of a gap in information in the market, and it also tells me that owners of corporations really didn't know where to go and how to get the right advice. I hope through our program, as long as we're here, that we can continue to keep the industry's pencil sharp, but also importantly share the information of what is expected costs, what's reasonable costs, how do we avoid potential price gouging. I think the lessons learned to date need to be shared, and I'll make sure that we do so. It's not fair on owners, corporations, and the last point is they're in a really difficult situation. You've got a representative group that is not equipped for major projects. It's not equipped to make the decisions. The Owners Corporation Act itself makes it quite difficult in terms of the decisions that need to be made. There is a need to support them, and there is a need to make sure that they're getting the right advice. And I don't think it's just through guidance notes. I think it's really that there is a real role for consumer protection to make sure that we have the right level of support, supporting owners, corporations through complex works where they have to engage many practitioners. And it's clear to me that if they were left on their own, that it would be a slow and very costly process. That's all I really want to say. I think, Andrew, before I get myself into trouble, back to you.
Terrific, thanks, Dan. Really appreciate your time today on providing that great update on the program and progress made to date, and the number of challenges that are faced by all of us, not only cladding but other building defects. So we've got heaps of questions coming through, so we'll attempt to sort of answer as many of those as possible. Just to give Dan a breath, I might have a crack at the first one. So we've got a question: beyond cladding, what building and fire safety defects were identified by the state audits? I think that was posted before Dan sort of got to that part of his presentation, and as you could see, there's some significant other defects that have been uncovered when we've pulled cladding off of these buildings. Probably the worst of it is that water damage and deterioration with the cladding itself either not being installed appropriately, inappropriate waterproofing of balconies or wet areas, so the bathrooms and shower areas. So that obviously is potentially an issue that may apply to buildings without combustible cladding on it as well. So it's an area of concern and something industry should be aware of. It's demonstrated itself across Australia. I think that is a definite construction area that we all need to consider and work towards eliminating. I suppose some of the other areas that we've identified are poorly designed and or installed and or maintained essential safety measures. So there are provisions within the building to assist with its fire safety. And the other area is lack of fire-rated linings. So especially where we're looking at these low-rise timber-framed buildings, there's a requirement to fire rate both sides of that, that framing. And once we pulled cladding off, it's become evident that that appropriate fire rating hasn't been applied to those walls. And the other area of concern would be poor fire rating of penetrations through fire rated elements, so through fire rated floors or walls in the building, that there's definitely an issue there, and that's formed part of a VBA project on essential measures, looking at how we can improve those outcomes, not only at the design and construction stage, but during maintenance as well, to ensure that we've got appropriate protection for the structures. Some of the other areas we've also noted is more in the design and documentation phases as well, that performance solutions have been poorly justified and sometimes questionable in their validity. So that's really a point of education that we've been concentrating on around performance solutions and the process, and getting a better understanding of industry around deemed to satisfy versus performance, and the appropriate process and level of documentation that's required to provide evidence of the performance solution. We've also had some questionable conditions placed on occupancy permits, which is concerning. So really stuff that should have been held over for issuing the occupancy permit, but the building surveyor has decided to actually issue the permit and put conditions on that subsequently haven't actually been addressed. So a number of years after the building's been occupied. So that's quite concerning also. Dan, I've got a question here for you if you're ready. I've got, how is the cladding replacement being funded? Is this by owners or is there support by the government?
Yeah, so cladding replacement is funded, well, in parts by both. So the government announced back in July last year that they'd fund, they put $600 million towards the cladding rectification program, with Cladding Safety Victoria being established to address the highest risk buildings that were identified through the statewide cladding audit. Part of that was straight appropriation, budget appropriation, and part of that was through a cladding levy, which is a building permit levy. That building permit levy will sit in place until the funds go to the rectification of the highest risk buildings that have been identified. The reality is not every building gets funding, because they're not all deemed highest risk, but some works may need to be done. So that's where the owners need to, initiate and find out their own finance to do those particular works. The original sort of basis, it was the moderates and lows, and many of those wouldn't necessarily require cladding removal or replacement. They might require other things to be addressed, or run the gauntlet of the Building Appeals Board to see what cladding can stay in place. So there's a bit of a mix. Where I was talking before about the many latent defects, that is the owners to fund. So we have a limitation to where we can go. Where there are substantial latent defects, the owners will, as you'd expect, will need to fund those. They're existing preconditions. But to answer your question, there's a bit of a mix of all. Andrew, I'll stay with you calling the questions if I can.
Yep, yeah, no problems, Dan. So is there any guidelines that are available to building surveyors as a template when dealing with project managers on sites that require removal of non-compliant cladding and to allow rectification works to occur?
Well, is there guidelines? There is an opportunity to have a very early discussion with the project managers and to work through the issues that are required. Cladding Safety Victoria, you know, we're happy to participate in that if that assists, and make sure that line of communication is well and truly open, and the expectations are made clear from the relevant building surveyor as the regulator.
Terrific, thanks Dan. I might take one myself. So has the PI insurance premium gone up because insurance companies foresee future problems with old non-approved clad buildings? So PI insurance, as I understand it, has gone up because of issues in general with building construction. Obviously cladding would have contributed that, and probably reasonably significantly as well. My understanding is that the insurers have been operating at a loss in the PI space, and and because of that have increased their premiums to sort of catch up in that space. So it's not necessarily just purely because of the risks, it's because of experienced losses that they've undertaken. They would be now factoring in sort of future risks as well in their premiums, etc. I've got another question, Dan. Will another EOI tender process be happening to grow the list of project managers used by CSV?
At this point in time, it's doubtful at this point in time. But we sort of reflect on our programs, we do our lessons learned in regular intervals, and we'll work out whether or not we have the bench strength to deal with all the buildings that we have. So it's not, I wouldn't rule it out completely, but at this stage it's unlikely.
Terrific. Trying to find another question here. Some of these we've already covered, I think.
There's a question here I can see. Andrew talks about the concern, and given the delays being experienced on account of latent defects and reliance on property owners to fund these repairs.
Yep.
So to progress those projects, would it be not prudent for CSV to enter into an arrangement with the property owners directly for funding the additional works to minimise delays and concerns for all parties? To some extent, that's what we try to achieve. Obviously, where you've got a real live project going on and you discover the latent defects later, it's a little bit more difficult to establish. But there are buildings where we have been able to clearly identify the range of defects much earlier, which gives an opportunity to let the owners know what type of cost and what type of finance they would require, access to the funds to actually support the contribution that CSV is making towards the cladding. And where we can do that effectively, you're right, that's the best way to move forward. That's most definitely the best, and gives the builder a much greater level of confidence that there is a funding stream for all their important work. Yeah, so back over to you, Andrew.
Very thanks, Dan. I might answer another one while you try and search for some other questions as well. I have a two-storey office complex I'm designing. Regs say I can have a cladding like Lucabond, but I'm hearing building surveyors are not covered by insurance. So a lot of practitioners, not just building surveyors, now have exclusions on their PI insurance as a response to the cladding issues, and that precludes or excludes, design in or with combustible cladding where it doesn't comply with the building code. So for a two-storey office, more than likely that would be type C construction, which the building code actually allows combustible cladding. If it's type A or type B, it doesn't, but there wouldn't be cover provided under most insurance policies currently in the current environment due to the exclusions. Dan, did you have another one? I've got another one here that I can probably address quickly. As a builder, when we come across a new cladding product on the market, what documents should we check before using it? So it's important to consult with appropriate experts. It is unfortunately a complex area, so there's lots of things other than just fire ratings. There's weatherproofing, structural considerations, and it's really important that the manufacturers have provided the appropriate test reports and evidence that the product actually meets all the requirements of the building code. Unfortunately, that hasn't occurred as well as it should have in the past, that manufacturers haven't necessarily provided all the information that should be provided for building surveyors and designers to be able to accept that. And the system has sometimes allowed that to work its way through due to the complexity of some of these materials and the information that's involved in it. So it is an area that we're looking at how we can further tighten up that process and get a better understanding across the industry on the key elements that need to be shown for compliance.
There's a question asking me how many fires have occurred in 4-storey buildings and less compared with ACP. And Chris answers it himself as best his knowledge. He hasn't heard of any. And the answer is, from my perspective, mate, I haven't heard of any either. But the reality is that it's a non-compliant material on a building, and we've seen, we've seen the consequences of inappropriately clad buildings. So we, working with the VBA to make sure that we concentrate on the highest risk buildings and make sure that the cladding comes off where we can.
I've got another one here. When will the VBA maintenance manual be updated? And probably an aligned one, are MBSs going to start looking at essential safety measures maintenance by owners? So they're both around that issue that has been identified with poor installation and maintenance of essential safety measures. The maintenance manual is currently under review, as is, so the VBA are actually doing what we're calling a ESM enhancement project. There was some additional information provided on the website around the roles and responsibilities in essential safety measures to get a better understanding of all parties around what essential safety measures are and who's responsible for what in that process. But we're looking at the whole process from design, installation and maintenance, and how we can provide more rigour on that. So hopefully that project will be sort of completed in the next 6 months or so to have some immediate sort of impact on ESMs and probably some longer term around some legislative rigour around the process as well.
There's another question here about what happens to buildings that have been rated high and extreme and referred to CSV for rectification for funding that turn out to be lesser risk. And that's the important part of our due diligence phase. It's sort of, if you think about the statewide cladding audit, it's sort of like a triage. It would, I suppose, attach a rating to a particular building based on some assumptions and based on as much evidence as can be gathered. It doesn't mean that all the evidence that's been gathered is accurate, and that's why the due diligence phase is important. So we actually have done, or identified of the 695 buildings, we've identified over 100 buildings that we believe should be re-rated, so or even taken off the list. And we're going through a process now to sort of discharge those buildings, making sure that whether it be the local government MBS or the VBA as MBS are aware of our thinking, and the aim is to get an agreed position on it. So yeah, that's right. It's important that we continue to examine, re-examine, and understand before sort of jumping into any rectification works. That's an important step in our process.
I've got one here. Most buildings were designed with a life of 50 years or less. However, there are many residential buildings beyond their life. Are these issues associated with issues beyond cladding? So, you know, most of these buildings that we're looking at are less than 10 years old. I think some of the water damage on timber frames has actually been in buildings that are only 6 or 7 years old as well. So that's, you know, quite concerning that they're you know, relatively new buildings. So to have that level of damage and poor construction that's contributing to that is quite concerning. So it is an area that we all need to focus on to improve. We might take one more question, Dan, if you've got.
Yeah, I might add to that, Andrew. Just yep. Of the 695, I don't think there's any building greater than 20 years of age in our list on that yep. 695. Andrew's absolutely correct. The majority of them would sit in around about the sort of 8 to 12-year mark. You know, it sort of matches the volume that went through the market at that particular point in time, and unfortunately, the quality of the build was not up to scratch on many of them. And perhaps can't use economic sort of activity as the excuse, but it's obviously people were quick to get on to the next job.
Did you have another question you'd like to answer as the last one, Dan? I've got one here. Well, you maybe get one last one. The audits have clearly demonstrated that fire-rated timber buildings are not being built properly. Very few builders can build these buildings properly. When will the BPB, Building Practitioners Board registration system change to ensure only builders with extensive experience can build these? So just a point there, the Building Practitioner Board is no longer that sort of done through the VBA now, but yes, it's probably a good point, because I think some of these, you know, and it's probably hearsay, but I think the impression is that some of these builders have come from traditional dwelling type construction into apartment construction, low rise, without a good understanding of the differences in that construction. That and there is obviously a bit of a gap there in the process around their understanding and their education in these buildings. Having said that, it's potentially sort of coming from other parties within the design process as well. So it's this is a really difficult space around the accountability, because sometimes it's in the design, sometimes in the construction, that if the builders have built it in accordance with the approved documents, you know, that's generally the best they can do. You would hope that they've got enough understanding to question designs that are inappropriate, but once again, due to the complexity of our construction environment, that's not always the case.
I'll just add to that, Andrew, because there's another couple of questions about the role of the original builders in the program.
Yep.
There is a process that the government agreed to sort of 12 months ago, which gave an opportunity for original builders of good standing to come back and to do the works if they could demonstrate that the works would be done on a zero profit basis. The reason we did that is many better builders would have argued that there was, as Andrew's just mentioned, supporting design advice that they received at the time about the application of particular products on the buildings. Now, where the building defects are beyond cladding, it's not the intention ever to invite the original builder back, or where the builder had a track record of poor performance or any disciplinary action, they weren't invited back. But we have invited a broad cross-section of the building industry back and given them the opportunity. Some have wanted to participate. Some of the, I think the high quality builders have wanted to participate because they see it as a reputational risk. Some of the less or smaller builders have struggled with the concept. Nevertheless, there was an opportunity, and there sits behind it an opportunity to recover costs as well from builders and other practitioners. That doesn't sit with Cladding Safety Victoria, that sits elsewhere in government, but there is an active cost recovery strategy that is rolling out that is looking to pull back some of the costs I suppose attach some liability to those that have done the wrong thing. So that's very active. Thanks, Andrew.
Terrific. Thanks once again, Dan, for today's presentation, and also to all of you, the attendees, for your interest. We had over 80 questions, so we'll have a look at those and hopefully be able to get you some responses to some of those other questions as well. There will be a short survey when you close this webinar that we would appreciate your participation in. So thanks once again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.